Is it merely a matter of quantity, or are we just a little bit smarter in some continuous way? Or do we have something that's fundamentally different that chimpanzees don't have, and Neanderthals either? And the answer is yes, we do have something different. We are symbolic creatures, and because we're symbolic creatures, we can build symbolic descriptions of relations and events. We can string them together and make stories. And because we can make stories, that's what makes us different. So that's my stump speech. That's how I start most of my talks on my own personal research. How do you express the notion that you've done something? By listing the steps that need to be taken in order to achieve the solution to that problem. You don't have to have done all of those steps, but you can say, here's what needs to be done. An example. Here's what needs to be done. We need to specify some behavior. We need to enumerate the constraints that make it possible to deal with that behavior. We have to implement a system because we're engineers and we don't think that we've understood something unless we can build it. And we've built such a system and we're about to demonstrate it to you today. That would be an example of enumerating a series of steps needed to realize the vision. So then, blah, 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 blah. And then you conclude by enumerating your contributions. It's kind of mirror of these steps, and it helps to establish that you've done something. So that's a kind of general purpose framework for doing a technical talk. Now, only a few more things left to do today. Getting famous is the next item on our agenda, because once you've got the job, you need to think a little bit about how you're going to be recognized for what you do. So, well, first of all, why should you care about getting famous? I thought about this in connection with a fundraising event I attended once. Fundraising event for raising money to save Venice from going underwater and having all of its art destroyed. Anyway, I was sitting here, and JC was sitting here. That was Julia, the late Julia Child. And as the evening wore on, more and more people would come up and ask Julia to autograph something or express a feeling that she had changed their life, and it just happened over and over again. So eventually I turned to Julia and I said, "Ms. Child, is it fun to be famous?" And she thought about it for a second and she said, "You get used to it." But you know what? It occurred to me, you never get used to being ignored. So it's here's a way to think about it. Your ideas are like your children, and you don't want them to go into the world in rags. So what you want to do is to be sure that you have these techniques, these mechanisms, these thoughts about how to present the ideas that you have so that they're recognized for the value that is in them. So that's why it's a legitimate thing to concern yourself with packaging. Now, how do you get remembered? Well, there's something I like to call Winston's star. And every one of the items I'm about to articulate starts with an S. So if you want your presentation ideas to be remembered, one of the things you need to do is to make sure that you have some kind of symbol associated with your work. So this arch example is actually from my PhD thesis many, many years ago. And in the course of my work at that time, this work on arch learning became mildly famous, and I didn't know why. It was only many years later that I realized that that work accidentally had all of the elements on this star. So the first element is that there was a kind of symbol. It's the arch itself. Next thing you need is some kind of slogan, a kind of phrase that provides a handle on the work. And in this case, the phrase was one-shot learning. And it was one shot because the program I wrote learned something definite from every example that was presented to us. So in going from a model based on this configuration to something that isn't an arch based on that configuration, the program learned that it has to be on top. One-shot learning. So that's a simple slogan, and now we need a surprise. Yeah, the surprise is you don't need a million examples of something to learn. You can do it with one example if you're smart enough to make use of that example appropriately. So that was the surprise. You can learn something definite from each example. Next item was a salient idea. Now, when I say salient idea, I don't mean important. What I mean is an idea that sticks out. Some theses, funnily enough, have too many good ideas and you don't know what it's all about because which one is it? So you need an idea that sticks out. And the idea that stuck out here was the notion of a near miss. You see, this is not an arch, but it doesn't miss by much. So it's a near miss. And finally, you need to tell the story of how you did it, how it works, why it's important. So that's a bit on how to, not so much get famous, but how to ensure that your work is recognized. Well, we're almost finished because now we're down to this last item, which is how to stop. And when we come to that, there's a question of, all right, well, what is the final slide? And what are the final words? So for the final slide, let me give you some examples of possibilities. How about this one? Well, you might see that slide and think to yourself, there are 1,000 faculty at MIT. Nice piece of work, but not so much, but it's only a tiny piece of work if you divide by 1,000. So when you show a whole gigantic list of collaborators at the end of a talk, it's a kind of letdown because it suggests that nobody knows, well, did you do anything significant? Now you got to recognize your collaborators, right? So where do you do that? Not on the last slide, on the first slide. All this was on the first slide. These are the collaborators. So you don't want to put them at the end. You don't want to slide like this. How about this one? This is the worst possible way to end a talk. Because this slide can be up there for 20 minutes. I've seen it happen. It squanders real estate. It squanders an opportunity to tell people who you are. It's just... What about this one? I often see it. I've never seen anybody write it down. Also, it wastes opportunity. Oh my God. Even worse. All of these slides do nothing for you. They waste an opportunity for you to tell people, to leave people with who you are. Well, what about this? This a good one? It might seem so at first, but here's the problem. If you say these are my conclusions, these are perfectly legitimate conclusions that nobody cares about. What they care about is what you have done. And that's why your final slide should have this label. Contributions. It's a mirror of what I said over there about how job talks ought to be like a sandwich. And the final slide, the one that's up there while people are asking questions and filing out, it ought to be the one that has your contributions on it. Here's an example from my own stump speech. Yeah, this is what I talk about a lot. Yes, here are the things that I typically demonstrate. and I wait for people to read it. And then the final element there is, this is what we get out of it. So that's an example of a contribution slide. All right, now, what about the other part? You know, you got your final slide up there as a contribution slide. Somehow you have to tell people you're finished. So let's check out a few possibilities. One thing you could do in the final words is you could tell a joke. It's okay. By the time you're done, people have adjusted themselves to your voice parameters. They're ready for a joke. I was sitting in another bar, this time in Austin, Texas, with a colleague of mine named Doug Lenat. And Doug's a fantastic speaker. And so I said to Doug, you're a fantastic speaker. What's your secret? And he said, oh, I always finish with a joke, and that way people think they've had fun the whole time. So yeah, a joke will work down there. How about this one? Thank you. I don't recommend it. It's a weak move. You will not go to hell if you conclude your talk by saying thank you, but it's a weak move, and here's why. When you say thank you, even worse, thank you for listening, it suggests that everybody has stayed that long out of politeness and that they had a profound desire to be somewhere else, but they're so polite they stuck it out.